Part 2. Lonely was the house, standing far apart from all neighbours. Other necromancers dwelt on the shores of Naat, but betwixt these and the hosts of Yadar there was little intercourse. And beyond the wild mountains that divided the isle, there dwelt only certain tribes of anthropophagi who warred with each other in the black woods of pine and cypress. The dead were housed in deep catacomb-like caves behind the mansion, lying all night in stone coffins and coming forth in daily resurrection to do the tasks ordained by the masters. Some tilled the rocky gardens on a slope sheltered from sea wind, others tended the sable goats and cattle, and still others were sent out as divers for pearls in the sea that ravened prodigiously, not to be dared by living swimmers on the bleak atolls and headlands horned with granite. Of such pearls Vashan had amassed a mighty store through years, exceeding the common span of life. And sometimes, in a ship that sailed contrary to the Black River, he or one of his sons would voyage to Zothik with certain of the dead for crew, and would trade the pearls for such things as their magic was unable to raise up in Naat. Strange it was to Yadar to see the companions of his voyage passing to and fro with the other leeches, greeting him only in mindless echo of his own salutations. And bitter it was, yet never without a dim, sorrowful sweetness, to behold Dalili and speak with her, trying vainly to revive the lost, ardent love in a heart that had gone fathom deep into oblivion and had not returned therefrom. And always with a desolate yearning he seemed to grope toward her across a gulf more terrible than the stemless tide that poured forever about the Isle of the Necromancers. Dalili, who had swum from childhood in the sunken lakes of Zyra, was among those enforced to dive for pearls. Often Yadar would accompany her to the shore and await her return from the mad surges, and at whiles he was tempted to fling himself after her and find, if such were possible, the peace of very death. This he would surely have doe, but amid the eerie wilderments of his plight and the grey webs of sorcery woven about it, it seemed that his old strength and resolution were wholly lacking. One day toward sunset time, as the month drew to its end, Vokal and Uldula approached the prince where he stood waiting on a rock-walled beach while Dalili dived far out in the torrent waters. Speaking no word, they beckoned to him with furtive signs, and Yadar, vaguely curious as to their intent, suffered them to lead him from the beach and by perilous paths that wound from crag to crag above the curving seashore. Ere the fall of darkness they came to a small landlocked harbour whose existence had been heretofore unsuspected by the nomad. In that placid bay, beneath the deep umbrage of the isle, there rode a galley with sombre purple sails, resembling the ship that Yadar had discerned moving steadily toward Zothik against the full tide of the Black River. Yadar was much bewildered, nor could he divine why they had brought him to the hidden harbour, nor the import of their gestures as they pointed out the strange vessel. Then, in a hushed and covert whisper, as if fearing to be overheard in that remote place, Vokal said to him, "If thou wilt aid my brother and me in the execution of a certain plan, thou shalt have the use of yonder galley in quitting Naat. And with thee, if such be thy desire, thou shalt take the girl Dalili, together with certain of the dead mariners for oarsmen. Favoured by the powerful gales which our enchantments will evoke for thee, thou shalt sail against the Black River and return to Zothik. But if thou helpest us not, then shall the weasel Esrit suck thy blood, till the last member of thy body has been emptied thereof, and Dalili shall remain as the bond-slave of Vachan, toiling for his avarice by day in the dark waters, and perchance serving his lust by night." At the promise of Vocal, Yadar felt something of hope and manhood revive within him, and it seemed that the baleful sorcery of Vashon was lifted from his mind, and an indignation against Vashon was awakened by Vocal's hintings, and he said quickly, "I will aid thee in thy plan, whatever it may be, if such aid is within my power to give." Then, with many fearful glances about and behind him, Uldullah took up the furtive whispering. "It is our thought that Vashon has lived beyond the allotted term, and has imposed his authority upon us too long. We, his sons, grow old, and we deem it no more than rightful that we should inherit the stored treasures and the magical supremacy of our father, ere age has debarred us from their enjoyment. Therefore we seek thy help in the slaying of Vashon." It came to Yadar, after brief reflection, that the killing of the necromancer should be held in all ways a righteous deed, and one to which he could lend himself without demeaning his valor or his manhood. So he said without demur, "I will help thee in this thing." Seeming greatly emboldened by Yadar's consent, Vocal spoke again in his turn, saying, "This thing must be accomplished ere tomorrow's eve, which will bring a full rounded moon from the Black River upon Naat, and will call the weasel demon Ezrit from his burrow. And tomorrow's forenoon is the only time when we can take Vashon unaware in his chamber. During those hours, as is his wont, he will peer entranced on a magic mirror that yields visions of the outer sea and the ships sailing over the sea and the lands lying beyond, and we must slay him before the mirror, striking swiftly and surely ere he awakens from his trance." At the hour set for the deed, Vocal and Uldullah came to Yadar, where he stood awaiting them in the outer hall. Each of the brothers bore in his right hand a long and coldly glittering scimitar, and Vocal also carried in his left a like weapon, which he offered to the prince, explaining that these scimitars had been tempered to a muttering of lethal runes and inscribed afterward with unspeakable death spells. Yadar, preferring his own sword, declined the wizard weapon, and, delaying no more, the three went hastily and with all possible stealth toward Vashon's chamber. The house was empty, for the dead had all gone forth to their labours, nor was there any whisper or shadow of those invisible beings, whether sprites of the air or mere phantoms, that waited upon Vashon and served him in sundry ways. Silently the three came to the portals of the chamber, where entrance was barred only by a black arras wrought with the signs of night in silver and bordered with a repetition of the fives names of the archfiend Poseidon in scarlet thread. The brothers paused, as if fearing to lift the arras, but Yadar, unhesitating, held it aside and passed into the chamber, and the twain followed him quickly as if for shame of their poltroonery. The room was large, high-vaulted, and lit by a dim window looking forth between unpruned cypresses toward the Black Sea. No flames arose from the myriad lamps to assist that baffled daylight, and shadows brimmed the place like a spectral fluid, through which the vessels of wizardry, the great censers and alembics and braziers, seemed to quiver like animate things. A little past the room's centre, his back to the doorway, Vashon sat on an ebon trivet before the mirror of clairvoyance, which was wrought from electrum in the form of a huge delta, and was held obliquely aloft by a serpentining copper arm. The mirror flamed brightly in the shadow, as if lit by some splendour of unknown source, and the intruders were dazzled by glimpsing of its radiance as they went forward. It seemed that Vashon had indeed been overcome by the wonted trance, for he peered rigidly into the mirror, immobile as a seated mummy. The brothers held back, while Yadar, thinking them close behind him, stole toward the necromancer with lifted blade. As he drew nearer, he perceived that Vachan held a great scimitar across his knees, and deeming that the sorcerer was perhaps forewarned, Yadar ran quickly up behind him and aimed a powerful stroke at his neck. But even while he aimed, his eyes were blinded by the strange brightness of the mirror, as though a sun had blazed into them from its depth across the shoulder of Vachan, and the blade swerved and bit slantingly into the collarbone, so that the necromancer, though sorely wounded, was saved from decapitation. Now it seemed likely that Vachan had foreknown the attempt to slay him, and had thought to do battle with his assailers when they came. But sitting at the mirror in pretended trance, he had no doubt been overpowered against his will by the weird brilliance, and had fallen into a mantic slumber. Fierce and swift as a wounded tiger, he leapt from the trivet, swinging his scimitar aloft as he tuned upon Yadar. The prince, still blinded, could neither strike again nor avoid the stroke of Vachan, and the scimitar clove deeply into his right shoulder, and he fell mortally wounded, and lay with his head upheld a little against the base of the snakish copper arm that supported the mirror. Lying there, with his life ebbing slowly, he beheld how Vokal sprang forward as with the desperation of one who sees imminent death, and hewed mightily into the neck of Vachan. The head, almost sundered from the body, toppled and hung by a strip of flesh and skin, yet Vachan, reeling, did not fall or die at once, as any mortal man should have done, but still animated by the wizard power within him, he ran about the chamber, striking great blows at the parricides. Blood gushed from his neck like a fountain as he ran, and his head swung to and fro like a monstrous pendulum on his breast, and all his blows went wild because he could no longer see to direct them, and his sons avoided him agilely, hewing into him oftentimes as he went past, and sometimes he stumbled over the fallen Yadar, or struck the mirror of Electrum with his sword, making it ring like a deep bell. And sometimes the battle passed beyond sight of the dying prince, toward the window that looked seaward, and he heard the strange crashings as if some of the magic furniture was shattered by the strokes of the warlock, and there were loud breathings from the sons of Vachan, and the dull sound of blows that went home as they still pursued their father. And anon the fight returned before Yadar, and he watched it with dimming eyes. Dire beyond telling was that combat, and Vokal and Uldila panted like spent runners ere the end. But, after a while, the power seemed to fail in Vachan with the draining of his lifeblood. He staggered from side to side as he ran, and his paces halted, and his blows became enfeebled. His raiment hung upon him in blood-soaked rags from the slashings of his sons, and certain of his members were half sundered, and his whole body was hacked and overscored like an executioner's block. At last, with a dexterous blow, Vokal severed the thin strip by which the head still depended, and the head dropped and rolled with many reboundings about the floor. Then, with a wild tottering, as if still fain to stand erect, the body of Vachan toppled down and lay thrashing like a great, headless fowl, heaving itself up and dropping back again incessantly. Never, with all its rearings, did the body quite regain its feet, but the scimitar was still held firmly in the right hand, and the corpse laid blindly about it, striking from the floor with sidelong slashes, or slicing down as it rose halfway to a standing posture. And the head still rolled, unresting, about the chamber, and maledictions came from its mouth in a pippy voice, no louder than that of a child. At this, Yadar saw that Vokal and Uldila drew back, as if somewhat aghast, and they turned toward the door, manifestly intending to quiet the room. But before Vokal, going first, had lifted the portal arras, there slithered beneath its folds the long, black, snakish body of the weasel familiar, Ezrit. And the familiar launched itself in air, reaching at one bound the throat of Vocal, and it clung there with teeth fastened to his flesh, sucking his blood steadily while he staggered about the room and strove in vain to tear it away with maddened fingers. Uldullah, it seemed, would have made some attempt to kill the creature, for he cried out, adjuring Vocal to stand firm, and raised his sword as if waiting for a chance to strike at Ezrit. But Vocal seemed to hear him not, or was too frenzied to obey his adjuration. And at that instant, the head of Vachara, in its rolling, bounded against Uldullah's feet, and the head, snarling ferociously, caught the hem of his robe with its teeth and hung there as he sprang back in panic fright. And though he sliced wildly at the head with his scimitar, the teeth refused to relinquish their hold. So he dropped his garment, and leaving it there with the still pendant head of his father, he fled naked from the room. And even as Uldullah fled, the life departed from Yadar, and he saw and heard no more. Dimly, from the depths of oblivion, Yadar beheld the flaring of remote lights and heard the chanting of a far voice. It seemed that he swam upward from black seas toward the voice and the lights, and he saw as if through a thin, watery film the face of Uldullah standing above him, and the fuming of strange vessels in the chamber of Vachan. And it seemed that Uldullah said to him, "Arise from death, and be obedient in all things to me the Master." So in answer to the unholy rites and incantations of necromancy, Yadar arose to such life as was possible for a resurrected lich. And he walked again, with the black gore of his wound in a great clot on his shoulder and breast, and made reply to Uldullah in the fashion of the living dead. Vaguely, and as matters of no import, he remembered something of his death and the circumstances preceding it. And vainly, with filmed eyes, in the wrecked chamber, he looked for the sundered head and body of Vachan, and for Vocal and the weasel demon. Then it seemed that Uldullah said to him, "Follow me." And he went forth with the necromancer into the light of the red, swollen moon that had soared from the black river upon Naat. There, on the fell before the house, was a vast heap of ashes, where coals glowed and glared like living eyes. Uldullah stood in contemplation before the heap, and Yadar stood beside him, knowing not that he gazed on the burnt-out pyre of Vachan and Vocal, which the dead slaves had built and fired at Uldullah's direction. Then with shrill, eerie wailings, a wind came suddenly from the sea, and lifting all the ashes and sparks in a great, swirling cloud, it swept them upon Yadar and the necromancer. The twain could hardly stand against that wind, and their hair and beards and garments were filled with the leavings of the pyre, and both were blinded thereby. Then the wind went up, sweeping the cloud of ashes over the mansion and into its doorways and windows, and through all its apartments. And for many days thereafter, little swirls of ash rose up under the feet of those who passed along the halls. And though there was a daily plying of besoms by the dead at Uldullah's injunction, it seemed that the place was never again wholly clean of those ashes. Regarding Uldullah, there remains little enough to be told, for his lordship over the dead was a brief thing. Abiding always alone, except for those leishes who attended him, he became possessed by a weird melancholy that turned quickly toward madness. No longer could he conceive the aims and objects of life, and the languor of death rose up around him like a black, stealthy sea, full of soft murmurs and shadow-like arms that were fain to draw him downward. Soon he came to envy the dead and to deem their lot desirable above any other. So carrying that scimitar he had used at the slaying of Vachan, he went into his father's chamber, which he had not entered since the raising up of Prince Yadar. There, beside the sun-bright mirror of divinations, he disemboweled himself and fell amid the dust and the cobwebs that had gathered heavily over all. And, since there was no other necromancer to bring him back even to a semblance of life, he lay rotting and undisturbed forever after. But in the gardens of Vachan, the dead people still laboured, heedless of Uldulla's passing, and they still kept the goats and cattle and dived for pearls in the dark, Torrent and Yadar, being with Dalili in that state now common to them both, was drawn to her with a ghostly yearning, and he felt a ghostly comfort in her nearness. The quick despair that had racked him aforetime and the long torments of desire and separation were as things faced and forgot, and he shared with Dalili a shadowy love and a dim contentment.